The Oscar goes to Brendan Fraser. The Whale.
Oh, what a return. The Renaissance is real, folks.
Here we go again.
People like to conveniently forget this, but once upon a time, as well as having a fandom, Brendan Fraser had a kind of anti-fandom. Not outright hostility, but just a kind of lemonness. Just a sort of unwillingness to embrace him as a screen presence, similar to Ben Affleck, Matthew McConaughey, or Keanu Reeves. Considered both too handsome to be relatable and too down-to-earth to be respected. Mostly disliked by men, but lusted after by women, and thus not to be taken too seriously. In other words, he was a movie star. It was just kind of darkly funny to see him fail because he felt like a studio product. I'm saying this up front because I want it on record not only that Hollywood press and social media are tremendously unfair and ungenerous to young actors who become popular with teenage girls, but that Fraser didn't lose his movie career and gain his subsequent renaissance by fighting against nothing. There was once a kind of abrasive anti-hype surrounding his projects amongst bitter, irony-poisoned sad boys, and it's only really in retrospect that perception has changed. And regardless of whoever bears the brunt of it, being a very in-demand nascent Hollywood star is a hell of a lot of weight for any young actor to shoulder, let alone how gracefully but nonetheless destructively Fraser handled it. Like, this is a guy who basically destroyed his body doing his own stunts to make audiences worldwide happy and received nothing but scorn from people less inclined to grant grace to the beautiful. And then in the late 2000s, his career hit a low point. He was injured, going through a costly divorce, and when he decided to speak out about his sexual assault in 2003, his career seemed to just stop completely. I don't know about you, but I personally remember when Furry Vengeance came out and the general vibe being, man, this guy's career is done. Like, that's the kind of bad movie that you would have been embarrassed to have been in on the way up, not after you've peaked.
Where were you for Furry Vengeance?
Touche, Mr. Fraser, touche. But then pretty much ever since that one interview, there's been a real public outpouring of respect and love for him, and so he's seen something of a career renaissance. Firstly by working with Steven Soderbergh, but more publicly by landing a repeat gig on Doom Patrol, and has been basically riding the wave of goodwill from there, to the degree that he's going to be in Martin Scorsese's latest coming later on this year. So yeah, in no small part because of the folks who passionately stuck by him, a lot of folks eventually came round on Brendan Fraser and realised that he was just a dude, trying to be good and do the best with what he had. It is just really nice to see the mainstream return and celebration of probably Hollywood's most sincere and earnest man, so earnest that his third and final appearance on Scrubs staked its third act twist on that very fact. And it has been genuinely exhilarating to watch the comeback of a guy who turned out to be one of the world's most innately likeable men, who not only is back with a vengeance in his first starring role in a decade, but turns in the performance of a lifetime. A performance so good that if you wanted to, you could spend hours using it to talk around the movie that it's in. In Darren Aronofsky's latest, Brendan Fraser turns in a performance as you have never seen him before, vulnerable and struggling for his own life against the weight of his past decisions. In a way, a kind of meta-performance resting very much on empathy for Fraser's fallen star, in a way not unlike what Aronofsky did for Mickey Rourke in his comeback performance in The Wrestler. Charlie's whole deal, the tragedy of his character, is that he is so empathetic and so generous with regards to other people, and yet has none of either for himself because of the depth of his own self-loathing. He wants and chooses to see the best in people, with his primary characteristic being a kind of toxic positivity that for the most part blinds him from the spite that people choose to throw at him. He places the blame on and ultimately cannot forgive himself for walking away from his family in pursuit of love, and for his lover subsequently dying, and so we find him amongst the wreckage of that during his final week, trying to make an honest attempt at emotional reconnection to his daughter, who absolutely despises him and everything he stands for. Much like Tim Robbins' performance as Andy Dufresne, Brendan Fraser's Charlie draws its power from being humble and gracious even within indignant circumstances. He has a huge heart and is seemingly infinitely human in spite of being of a type that society is so eager and willing to dismiss. It's quite easy, like so many others have, to fall in love with Fraser's performance here, because what he does is so tender and heartfelt and so nakedly vulnerable that you can't help but feel for that. What holds it together is is that Fraser is, and always has been, a man of great humility. There's seemingly no ego or shame to the man, and so he's willing to go through the physical toll of wearing a heavy makeup suit in the hopes of finding, pulling out, and displaying the humanity within that. Something particularly admirable is how Fraser himself said that he saw something heroic in the character and wanted to present that. He does seem to genuinely appreciate and respect the gravity of the task at hand and what it means to represent an issue like obesity. And indeed, that heroic struggle shines through on the screen as we watch Charlie wrestle with his own soul whilst in his final moments trying to inspire and achieve some sort of redemption. In short, you believe it when Charlie declares that people are amazing. Before I move on, I just want it on record that whatever else I'm going to say about the movie, a lot of the insincerity that I'm about to litigate isn't coming from Fraser's performance. Personally, I believe it when he says that he wanted to do the subject justice, given the sheer degree of sincerity and earnestness with which he approaches that character. It really is his finest hour. Quite literally, he's never been better, and I'm as glad as anyone that he got to take his victory lap at all of the various award ceremonies. There are, however, deeper, more important issues that I would like to focus on because, to put it bluntly, Fraser's performance here is a feature in a whole hive of bugs. The Whale is probably going to go down as this year's most controversial movie, given and especially because its lead performance won an Academy Award for it. There is a sizable chasm between the intensity of the marketing around Brendan Fraser's performance, with all the sincerity of audiences wanting to see him do well so as to solidify his comeback, and the movie that performance is in, which is a dreary, ugly, dissonant, remarkably dour mess, insincerely posing as something kitschy and hopeful. It is, in essence, trying to have it both ways, simultaneously trying to break down and challenge dominant narratives about fat people and the abuse that they face, whilst adhering to the very same narratives that enable the abuse in the first place, and being uncritical in doing so. It takes its low-hanging observation that there are sad stories inside the bodies of those society demonises, that fat people are people too, and just stays there in neutral, seemingly impressed with itself over its own mediocre sense of empathy and lack of imagination for the inner life of its subject. The movie is ultimately an incredibly vulgar expression of its own publicly stated aims, with which it clashes profoundly, and so by laser focusing on Brendan Fraser's acting here would do the issue a real disservice, because I find that the movie's sentimentality and altruistic sheen is ultimately a kind of charm offensive, because the underlying film is, upon closer examination, quite loathsome. To be honest, I can't even really blame A24 for over-focusing on Brendan Fraser's acting here, because I can only imagine trying to do publicity for The Whale is like trying to build a house out of peas. Because indeed, the only substantive reason anyone can talk about this movie and why it was getting rave reviews all the way back in February is because Brendan Fraser committed himself and gave his all to material that is absolutely beneath that effort. Cynically, it's kind of a teachable moment for directors. Like, if you have material that you suspect is bad, insubstantial, and or problematic, get yourself a needlessly overcommitted actor, preferably a Twitter cinnamon roll, and thus you can hang all your publicity on that. In that spirit, I for one can't wait for Tom Hardy's over-thorough interpretation of Simple Jack. Honestly, all it really reminds me of is when producers occasionally stunt cast very talented character actors for roles like the Green Goblin or Bane or Loki or the Penguin, and thus give them a degree of depth and complexity and credibility that they otherwise wouldn't innately possess. Because it's not as if you could remove Brendan Fraser from that character and it would magically still be good. From a story perspective, The Whale just simply isn't breaking any new ground, if indeed there is any to break. It's a pretty bog-standard morality play about hiding pain with indulgence, and picks for itself a particularly insidious framing device for that: obesity. Say, does anyone remember £7? Anyone else remember that? That Will Smith vehicle about the guy who wants to kill himself and donate his organs as self-penance for a car accident he caused which killed several people, and that fact is hidden from you as a twist in the third act, because by the time that you realise that's stupid, he's already past the point of no return and the movie's over, and it was one of the most unwatchably dour and emotionally manipulative movies you'd ever seen. No one else? No reason, it was just on my mind. Now, there are sophisticated and unsophisticated conversations to be had about whether or not life at £600 is as much a death sentence as the movie insists it is, and almost as important to talk about that is the cultural context that it was released into, and so I'm going to use that as the segue into a primer on how not to talk about fat people. Firstly, obesity is a hell of a loaded term in discussions about weight and health. Obesity is defined medically by an excess in body fat which may cause adverse long-term health effects such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, osteoarthritis and some types of cancer, among other problems. In other words, it is considered a risk factor in other serious physical and mental illnesses, but not an illness in and of itself. I feel like this distinction is important to make because a lot of the social stigma surrounding fat people is based on the assumed one-to-one correlation of fatness and unhealthiness. It also needs to be said that thin people are not by any means uniquely immune to any of those conditions either. Keep in mind, of course, I am not a doctor and what I'm about to say isn't health advice, but to the best of my understanding, if you are considered obese and you don't have any kind of underlying health issue, like if you don't have an increased heart rate, blood pressure, or chronic physical pain, then you're probably going to be okay. You are still at risk of those aforementioned problems, but the worst, most tangible thing that you'll experience in the immediate is society's presumption and judgment of your body as an undisciplined moral failing. It's actually shockingly common for doctors to overlook serious physical and mental ailments in their patients in order to treat their more readily visible weight issue, to the degree that fat patients going to the doctor for an ailment and having that ailment be ignored until it's discovered there's cancer beyond the point of treatment is pretty much its own non-fiction media genre at this point. The other thing is that body mass index is a notoriously dodgy approximation when it comes to health. What BMI does is take your weight and divide that by the square of your height to approximate your body fat percentage, but it doesn't account for things like short stature or unusual amounts of muscle mass like what bodybuilders have, or where fat in that particular person's body is stored, or indeed anything else that might contribute to weight that isn't fat. The problem being that it doesn't differentiate between weight gained by fat or by muscle mass. Not to mention, BMI was never intended to be a means of medical assessment. It was developed by Adolphe Quetelet as part of a wider study to find the average man using a sample size of a small Belgian town in the 1800s and is thus extremely biased in favour of European men. Work which would incidentally become later foundational in the development of the eugenics movement. Gosh, isn't history fun? What BMI cannot do is tell you how healthy a person is based on those measurements. That perspective is both speculative and presumptive, and personally I think it's kind of gross the way that we categorise entire types of people as healthy or unhealthy based on how much of them there is. BMI is no more an objective measure of your health than your testosterone levels are an objective measure of your manliness. The other problem is that diet culture, the mainstream accepted solution to obesity, straight up sucks. And this one is the real kicker, because it doesn't matter what kind of body you have, you are not immune to anorexia, bulimia, orthorexia, or any number of eating disorders. Social stigma around fatness is so real to the degree that people find themselves wearing down their bodies, becoming incredibly unhealthy and ending up in the hospital trying to pursue a lifestyle to avoid becoming one of them. That, alongside how long-term sustained weight loss has been shown to be statistically quite rare, means that people so very often get caught in a feedback loop of failure and self-punishment as a result, because unhealthy thinness isn't stigmatized in the way that fatness overtly is. Wellness is an enormously lucrative industry precisely because people become lifelong customers trying to maintain a very narrow, particular, socially unstigmatized body type that often requires an amount of physical and mental upkeep that a great many people, through no fault of their own, are simply unable to achieve. Like, speaking anecdotally here for a second, the number of friends that I happen to have who cannot exert themselves physically because they have either fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, major depression, or any number of conditions that either impair or outright prevent sustained exercise is not insubstantial. Alongside this, one of the main barriers to supposed healthy eating is class. As Dan Olson so succinctly put it, what you eat says something about what you have access to, and access is dictated by class, and class in our society is so very often dictated by race. When it comes to feeding yourself, you can only really play the hand that you're dealt, and so people bring home and reheat frozen, calorie-dense foods because it's more readily available for people who make $9.50 an hour, and more often than not, what constitutes healthy food isn't driven by actual nutritional value, but respectability politics. There's an ongoing meme that if you eat chunks of beef, tomatoes, lettuce, mayo, cheese, and pieces of bread in the form of a salad, that's considered healthy, but if it looks like or is in the shape of a cheeseburger, that's considered unhealthy. And of course, healthy food can be just as processed with added sugar and salt as classic unhealthy foods, and giant corporations will nonetheless still charge you more for the healthy version. It's not even to mention that organic raw foods are simply not enough on their own to sustain a person in terms terms of pure nutrition, nor are particularly shelf-stable either, so I hope you like having to buy food a lot, as well as having in itself a fairly inconsistent definition. There are other dimensions to this that are also worth considering, such as increasingly less health risks for obesity because of more available and more adequate healthcare, and more often than not the barrier to that care is financial. There's tons of people that in fact argue that if you really want to tackle obesity as a social issue, the solution ought to be free healthcare, alongside regulating food additives, subsidising fresh produce, funding free public exercise programs, and better nutritional education. Admittedly, those aren't quite as empowering and darkly pleasurable as shaming people for their eating habits, but you know. Now, the important thing that I need to re-emphasise here is that cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and all the other physical and mental ailments that I mentioned before are real, and having an inconsiderate diet can and does put you at risk of those problems. I don't want to mislead you into thinking these problems aren't real or that mainstream science and medicine is a bunch of baloney. I am a good YouTuber and I do not knowingly put out bad information. But the practical reality of the situation is that weight gain can be caused by any number of things. Dieting and lack of exercise, yes, but there's also genetic susceptibility, medications, hormones, socioeconomic factors, or perhaps you have an underlying mental health problem like an eating disorder, all of which complicate the notion that weight gain is nothing more than calories in, calories out. There is so much that goes into the science of how your body takes on and burns off weight, but all of those things so often go overlooked in favour of mocking fat people because lol, too much pie. Speaking personally for a minute, and long-term viewers will be aware of this, I have a weight problem in no small part because when I needed to start taking medication in 2015, the story for why is for another time, I shot up a couple of sizes and no sustained effort to go to the gym has yet rectified that, and lockdown during COVID did me no favours. I continue to be frustrated with my results, and culture encourages me to hate myself for falling outside of the mainstream physical accepted definition of healthy. And it's for those reasons, along with those previously mentioned, that health at every size and fat advocacy groups generally tend to argue for normalisation, or at the very least destigmatisation, less trying to police people's bodies and thus less enforcement of a particular psychological relationship with their bodies, instead advocating for people to adopt healthier behaviours regardless of size. In short, being fat is normal because quite literally not every body is made the same, and it's not a moral or spiritual failing to have a muffin top. I don't know about you, but in retrospect I think it was probably a shit idea for us to get most of our contemporary mainstream dieting opinions from that documentary about the guy who ate McDonald's every meal for every day for 30 days and then went into poor health, but then later admitted that he was an alcoholic at the time, thus significantly skewing the test results.
My advice to you as a physician is that you've got to stop. You're pickling your liver. Yeah. If you're an alcoholic, I'd say you stop. I say you're going to die. You keep drinking, you'll die.
I'm giving all of this the space that it has, by the way, because I want to acknowledge that obesity as a social issue exists at the cross-section of so many other societal complications that are all wrapped up in it in equal measure, and you can't really address the topic without bumping up against all of those other complications in whole or in part, and it's for that reason that I think it's really important to acknowledge that, try as I might, a wee little video essay like this cannot hope to do the full scope of the topic justice. Quite aside from that, there's the issue of the language that we use to have these conversations. People claim to be sympathetic and reasonable in being aware of the unnecessary suffering of fat people at the hands of society, and can still ultimately end up reaffirming unfounded social truisms and stigmas about size. More often than not, the word obese is accompanied by the adjective morbidly, which not only means literally disturbing, unpleasant, and/or indicative of disease in a very ghoulish Victorian horror way, but is deeply awful phrasing when trying to describe another person with a presumed medical condition. But let's aim a little higher here. Let's say, purely for the sake of argument, that being fat is inherently bad and unhealthy, assuming the given value of that word, and that the people who go through it are broken and indeed desperately need to be helped. Why is it then that people feel the need to make their arguments for that position with thumbnails like this or with rhetoric like this? Because surely the truth is enough. And surely still this type of antagonism isn't going to get people out of a thing that we assume as a kind of suffering, right? Surely it's possible to help without making condemnations.
You're not the person Michael Burke is talking about. He's talking about the vast majority, which is not you, where it's simply a case of donut addiction.
America has now become the fattest nation in the world. Congratulations.
They make excuses, don't they, fat people? They say, it's glandular. It's not glandular, it's greed, okay? It's big bones. Yeah, big bones covered in meat and gravy.
You know, I've seen some TikToks made by him where he is addressing people telling him that he needs to lose weight as trolls. I just wonder, you know, is it really trolls? I mean, certainly there are mean people on the internet, but there is some truth to it.
I think, Angelina, that a bit of fat shaming is a good thing. People say to me, you put on a bit of timber, mate. It makes me go back and try and lose a bit of timber. I need to have people look at me going, hey, big boy, lose a bit.
God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds.
The bigger problem here, and the wider context of this issue, is that obesity isn't merely used as a healthcare diagnosis, but also a moral one. That obesity supposedly implies the inner illness of the person, and is partially the source of the metaphysical illness of society. This is why I don't simply accept the idea that obesity is a matter of public health at face value, because so much of the rhetoric within that conversation is highly moralistic in tone, in a way which it wouldn't be if it was just caring for people's health. So much of anti-fatness is overtly condemnatory, that their bodies are wrong and or abhorrent and needs to be fixed. Language which shares the same space as the kind of invective that disability rights activists have had to deal with for decades. And for some reason, despite how no sustained effort to scold and shame fat people into losing weight has had any sustained impact, people are nonetheless still willing to give it a go for themselves. Fat people are seen less as people who want to simply be allowed to live with dignity, and more as problems society has stubbornly refused to yet solve, in the same grouping as drug addicts, a sort of temporary, fallen state of being that implies inside every fat person is an undisciplined thin person hoping to be rescued, a thing that only the broken and desperate would inflict on themselves, because in the logic of the bully, why else would you willingly become a thing you know you will be punished for? The worst part being that people often make it your fault for why they think you're discomforting to look at. To sharpen that point, this is why it's inherently problematic that in media actors so often wear fat suits in order to portray them, and more often than not use that fact as a punchline to a joke, using fatness rhetorically as the equivalent of a silly hat or a clown nose.
Shut up! The camera adds 10 pounds.
So how many cameras are actually on you?
And even serious attempts at depicting fat people's lives are often met with derision. I was incredibly disheartened to see a lot of the early reviews for The Whale that came out of Venice use deeply unflattering and frankly insulting phrases like blubber, rotund, a giant pool of flesh. Too many individual examples to show all of. I make it a point to not do call-outs in this show. I tried not to because I've utterly no interest in being in the business of public shaming for clout, but in this case I feel I should make an exception. You folks really showed your whole asses there. This includes, and is especially the case with that Rotten Tomatoes summary, a song of empathy that will leave most viewers blubbering. Gosh, aren't cinephiles brilliant? Right, either praise the central performance as being genuinely moving, or have a tacky little pun. You cannot have both. This is not how an allegedly decent and caring world talk about people like Charlie. The bottom line is, fat people have to live in a world in which they are never not reminded that people hate the fucking sight of them. At worst, you're an abhorrent monster. At best, you're a fixer-upper, with the world pretending to be a concerned onlooker to the crime scene of your body. And movies like The Whale do zero justice to their own self-image. Now, I feel like I should admit something at this point, which is that it did take me a while to build up to wanting to watch the film. I worried about it, and I worried about it, and I worried about it, and for me, I think it ultimately comes down to this. I don't trust Darren Aronofsky with this subject. I find that there's a grotesque quality to his work that has hampered most of his serious attempts at drama. In and amongst the 90s American independent scene he rode in on, Darren Aronofsky developed something of a reputation. Even whilst the 90s was very much a place for dark, psychological, cerebral storytelling, his cinema was nonetheless challenging and abrasive. Aronofsky, particularly his early work, has very often wallowed in decay and entropy. As discussed by others, characters often begin their journeys in search of something beyond the self, beyond the physical, and end up paying for it with their minds and bodies. In Pi, Max Cohen loses his mind trying to find the underlying mathematical order of reality. Requiem for a Dream features multiple characters who destroyed themselves in pursuit of various addictions. The Fountain has 3 versions of the same couple across time who struggle to find the answer to eternal life, and all involve the transmutation of being. And in both The Wrestler and Black Swan, Randy and Nina similarly sacrificed their bodies for the sake of their art in what was originally supposed to be 2 intertwining narratives sharing the same movie. It's a style and sensibility that harkens back to Cronenberg, but rather than long live the new flesh, Aronofsky is interested in the destruction of the old flesh, along with the various mentalities that take us there, the inherent transformative nature of pain and endurance, the harm that people bring upon themselves in pursuit of larger ideals. This, combined with a certain degree of spirituality, gives his narratives a strong sense of weathering a storm. His protagonists go through some rough, dark shit, and more often than not come out worse, or at least deeply transformed on the other side. Something worth noting is that Aronofsky's films exist by and large within the subjective, i.e. the story very rarely informs the audience of anything the protagonist is not directly aware of, and so he offers a perspective both informed and limited by what directly happens. It also allows him to engage in dream and nightmare logic, something which is an almost constant across his stories. We talked about this a little bit in The Graduate, the way in which the form of the film takes on and expresses the content of the film, and in the 2000s, Aronofsky was somewhat revelatory in finding new ways to express that thanks to breakthroughs in digital editing and effects. He helped make stories more tangible, but reality less so. It's also the case that, unlike someone like William Friedkin, whose work we discussed in the Bug episode, Aronofsky can be quite a forceful storyteller, for better or worse. He tries not to offer intricate plotting or grand story arcs, but rather the experiential palpability of his characters, taking extreme states of being, paranoia, drug addiction, nirvana, the physical stress of performance art, etc., and making the audience feel through that with the use of traditional cinematic language and sound design, a kind of pure cinema driven by the domino chain of character actions. Both Pi and Requiem for a Dream were exceptionally good at doing that, getting the audience to feel and understand the unique head and body space of people who are severely addicted and or mentally collapsing.
Can you walk?
I'm walking across the stage. And you should see my Harry on television. We're giving the prizes away. I just wanted to be on the show.
Contextually, Aronofsky's last three films, including The Whale, have been the most controversial of his career. Noah pissed off spiritually minded audiences the world over with its usage of non-biblical sources such as the Book of Enoch, as well as its general self-hating anti-humanism and environmentalism, its obnoxious sanctimony towards non-veganism, its weird infanticide subplot, and general Holy Scripture as Lord of the Rings-esque epic fantasy, but nonetheless became the highest grossing movie of his career. Wait, actually, hold on.
Hey Sam?
Yeah?
If I remember correctly, you saw Noah back when it originally came out, right? What did you think of it? I see. It's been literally back there the entire time.
Mother, being similarly environmentally themed, was an absurdist horror that reframes Mother Earth and God's relation to humanity as a profoundly emotionally abusive home invasion story, which drew equal parts criticism, ire, and ridicule for its depictions of violence, its unforgivingly gauche allegorical storytelling, and its, frankly, ridiculous heavy-handedness.
I gave you everything! You gave it all away.
Film Twitter is probably going to give me hell for saying this, but I kind of feel like Darren Aronofsky and Zack Snyder are in a similar class of filmmaker in as much as they are both art bros. Like, the kind of person who takes a dude bro approach to art, which is to say the kind of person who overvalues viscerality and realness to their own detriment. It's also worth noting that they are both very religious men who seem drawn to stories of spirited people who weather the storm of reality. The long and the short of it is that, as previously outlined, the subject requires tremendous delicacy to handle appropriately, and Aronofsky has proven more often than not to be quite an indelicate filmmaker, is the issue. There's been so much talk on the part of the filmmakers and the film itself about trying to be honest and truthful here, relying heavily on the given values of those concepts, but the real question is honesty to what and truthfulness for whom? Remember that a key thing about Aronofsky's style is expressionism, the form of the film mirroring the content of the film, and so the palpability that Aronofsky offers here is slow and heavy. Shots last slightly longer than they probably ought to, the pacing of the scenes is drawn out, there's a lot of dead air in places, and much is made of Charlie's struggle to stand up and the physical exhaustion of him moving. The reason for this is because Charlie is a character with a lot of baggage, both mentally and physically. Let's not unpack the crassness of that for the time being. For this reason, it's unfortunately the case
that the movie is incredibly stagey. Like, yeah, it was once a stage play, but the movie takes no real advantage of the medium change, and so Charlie is for the most part either on the couch or in bed whilst other characters enter and do stuff, and everything is blocked around Charlie's general immobility. On its own merits, it is not a good adaptation at all, and is by far Aronofsky's least cinematic, least visually dynamic film in many respects. But my point here is that in its form, the film makes a bunch of base assumptions about its subjects that are informative as to how its subject is framed. Now, the thing about realism, I find, is that from an artistic perspective, it's kind of an empty category which artists fill with their own ideas, simply because there's no real consensus on what that should mean. There's realism tropes, certainly, but there's no real objective, standardised idea of realism because people think about and conceptualise the world very differently. This applies equally to other art styles too, by the way. Magritte is very different from Dali, but the two are nonetheless still doing surrealism in their own way. And without over-explaining myself here, I personally think it's always worth unpacking realism whenever art presents you with it, because when an artist shows you something and says, this is real, it speaks to certain priorities present in what the artist values as real, objective, and ordinary. It's kind of a category error thing, like trying to point to New York when you're standing in Times Square. It's a thing that we're inside of, and so what you choose to emphasise and frame a certain way can't help but be revealing. Now, whilst The Whale doesn't claim to be objective, it takes place in Charlie's subjective point of view for the most part, it does purport to be an honest and frank depiction of its subject, and the fact that it takes a very deliberate and pointedly unflattering view is revealing as to how the filmmakers consider the inner life of the people it claims to speak for. It's quite hard to take Darren Aronofsky's claim that he's made a very sensitive and thoughtful portrait of its subject at face value, given that he's also made it look like B-roll from Seven. Like, seriously, what is this gothic, decrepit cinematography doing if not presuming the squalor of Charlie's inner life? Like, it's a bit underhanded, don't you think? Whilst the movie thinks it's being a very sympathetic portrait of this kind of person and his world by presenting both very starkly, like the uncomfortable realism is meant to be taken as honest, the film still finds ways through those parameters to judge Charlie for who he is and what he does. One of the things that I do like is that the film doesn't contain any real gross-ups, like close-ups of food to emphasise grossness, like going into mouth, etc., which is one of the things that I was really worried about. Generally speaking, I think that Charlie's eating disorder is better depicted than, say, Sarah Goldfarb's plot in Rec Room for a Dream, which from a visual language standpoint was dripping with a cartoonish degree of fat phobia, and whilst it did suit that movie's overall surreal, out of proportion nightmarishness, it makes her very real problem seem needlessly absurd. There is a key montage here where Charlie binge eats a lot in a small amount of time, but the cinematography is, in its own way, somewhat tactful, kept at a medium and wide, and so is deliberately less emphatic, less focused on his mouth and the things going into it, which is a good call. But someone forgot to tell the sound department. And so you can basically still hear every single thing happening in Charlie's mouth, both masticating and puking it back out again. In particular, Rob Simonson's score swelling tragically as he chooses to eat his feelings as though he's condemned himself to food hell. Oh no, not the mayo. Anything but the mayo! Though I will say that hastily made flaming hot Dorito and grape jelly sandwich would make a great recreation on binging with Babish soon. There's more than a handful of really daft moments in here, like where Liz very gravely and solemnly hands Charlie his bucket of chicken and it's treated with all the mournful stoicism of handing him a noose, and Charlie contemplating which drawer to take a snack from, the good drawer full of granola bars or the bad drawer full of Three Musketeers. We also need to add some dramatic tension because otherwise this movie would be a stale, boring, miserable character drama, so thank God Charlie nearly chokes to death on a meatball sub in the middle of a scene, which is used as the catalyst for his later health decline. And it's also not enough for Charlie to just be fat. He's also greasy and balding, he wheezes, he pukes down his own shirt, which is often covered in crumbs, the aforementioned mouth noises, and the foot the movie chooses to start out on is being walked in on whilst having a heart attack and masturbating. It is quite genuinely amazing how Brendan Fraser was able to pull such an empathetic performance out of that character, given how much the deck is stacked against him by the filmmakers. And of course, keep in mind, because I won't let you forget it, that this is supposed to be an honest portrayal of its own subject, which, says something, doesn't it? I suppose I should talk about Samuel Hunter briefly, given that it's his play and adapted screenplay that informs a lot of what we're discussing here. According to interviews he's given, a lot is drawn from direct personal inspiration. Hunter was an English teacher trying to get bored students to meaningfully engage with classic works such as Moby Dick and being frustrated with just the endless parade of copy-pasted Wikipedia summaries. Like Charlie, one gets fed up after a while and just wants students to write something honest, even if it's wholly negative or poorly informed, something I imagine plenty of English teachers can relate to. A lot of the play and movie by inheritance examines and deals with queer self-loathing, where Charlie expresses sincere regrets about having left his family for a male lover and his own complicated relationship with food as a way to both comfort and self-punish for that. Sam Hunter was raised in a religious family in Idaho and was actually kicked out of high school when he came out as a teenager, and whilst he was never 600 pounds, he did himself struggle with an eating disorder, and I suppose on some level Charlie may well be an expression of how things could have turned out for him. It all seemingly comes from a very real place for him, which is why I'm going to pull my punch here, a gesture I imagine a great many of you would rightfully feel less inclined to extend. Ultimately, the key thing I find here is that Charlie didn't really need to be fat for the story to work. This could have been about an obsessive hoarder, and the underlying premise of a man trying to get his daughter to empathise with him despite a deeply hurtful past infraction would more or less go unaffected. I mean, hell, it could have been about a thin man aggressively eating themselves into poor health, and the intent of the project would function identically. In both cases, the Moby Dick extended metaphor still works because the focus of the drama is on how the pain of the original hurt is such that it creates long-standing repercussions, and how holding on to that pain vengefully will cost you far more than the original wrong ever did. Seemingly the only reason why it's even called The Whale and is using fatness as a core aspect of its identity is because we're doing a Moby Dick thing, and, well, how else to represent that very visual illusion? They may as well have called it Elephant in the Room for all the sensitivity that it fails to handle. It just seems as though Sam Hunter wanted to write a play that unpacked and dealt with queer self-loathing as a story and just didn't think to discern the ethics of using fatness as the vector through which to express that. My point here being that the way in which fatness is used here as the emotional barrier stopping Ellie from seeing her father as a person and not an object to throw her invective at says something about how the authors conceptualise fatness as a state of being, and so much of the backlash to the movie pertains to exactly this problematic usage, that the Moby Dick illusion of the story necessitates that the title character be an avatar for a monstered other. It's also for that reason that defenders of the movie will make the point that it's not really about obesity, that you could functionally tell the same story about someone struggling with alcoholism or drug addiction and it would more or less still work, as I've low-key just argued. But the fact that it is about obesity and uses the same vocabulary and structure of a story about suicide via alcoholism or drug addiction creates all the problematic implications that we've been discussing, and as a defence speaks volumes as to how people conceptualise fatness in the first place. Regardless of the stated intent of empathy from the production, we are still fundamentally working from the premise that fatness is a physical outer manifestation of internal struggle and bad coping mechanisms.
You'd be disgusting even if you weren't this fat.
Why yes, Ellie, but it's certainly convenient that that is also the case. It's a story full of characters who are struggling with a kind of emotional blindness because their own situation is far too difficult to deal with. So Charlie is so full of toxic positivity that he ignores his own health. Ellie is cruel and poisoned by hatred that she cannot recognise her dying father trying to help her. Liz has such a great need to help Charlie that she ends up being his enabler, or at least that's how the story chooses to frame her buying food for her dying immobile friend. Thomas is so blinded by his own religious principles that his sense of helping Charlie involves disrespectfully trying to get him to repent for his homosexuality, stuff like that. As a theme, this ends up being kind of a weird projection though, because the whale is itself so blinded by its need to appear to be doing its subject justice to the degree that nobody involved seems to be discerning or even cognizant of the harm that it's doing. I think it's quite telling that so much of the movie has characters yelling all kinds of passionate invective at Charlie and him not pushing back, but being constantly apologetic. Saying sorry is his major repeating line.
I'm sorry. 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 I'm sorry.
Not just for his actions, past and present, but implicitly for who and what he is, what he's putting Liz through in doing this.
I'm sorry.
What are you sorry about?
I'm sorry. I don't know, just sorry.
And for me, that says a lot, that the movie takes shame as its default, as its baseline. What this is all setting up isn't a moment where Charlie pushes back against the invective he faces, where he defends himself or just argues for his own dignity. He takes it all in stride and is all too willing to interpret that hurt with a toxic positivity that persists until the very end. Barely a scene goes by without Charlie being harassed and interrogated for his body, and Charlie refuses to actually push back on it because the movie has a really fetishistic attitude towards its own sense of honesty and is all too willing to absolve the hatred that Charlie faces. I mean, it's not much of a surprise given how firmly the deck is stacked against him that the movie refuses to hold its characters to account for the things that they throw at him, because regardless of him dying of heart failure, Charlie's body is consistently portrayed as a problem that needs to be fixed. This is what I consider easily the worst, most pernicious aspect of The Whale as a project, the way in which it expects its subjects to be humble and gracious in the face of the disproportionate cruelty and punishment that society chooses to throw at them, in no small part because the movie doesn't really think that invective is as much a problem as Charlie's body is. I'm not saying Charlie needs to lose his endless positivity necessarily, but I don't think anyone in the audience would object to pushing back at shit like this. Like, he doesn't need to stop having faith in humanity, but there is a line, and this is definitely over it.
There'll be a grease fire in hell when he starts to burn.
It's a dagger in the heart, because I feel like what this story really calls for is an Elephant Man-style moment where our protagonist, finally worn down by the spite of the world, demands to be respected.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
But that's not what happens. Quite the opposite, in fact. The closest equivalent story moment is the subplot with Dan the delivery driver, who, upon seeing Charlie at his doorstep, is revolted, which causes Charlie to have his binge eating episode, which becomes the final level down of his health decline. Charlie does have a character arc nonetheless though. He goes from being someone who teaches the idea that revising one's ideas helps communicate more clearly and persuasively to someone who, after being worn down, just wants people to be as direct and honest as possible, which just so happens to put him directly at the mercy of other people's spite. The way in which Charlie constantly, and I do mean constantly, makes excuses for Ellie's deeply mean and insufferably hateful rhetoric, alongside his refusal to want to help himself, the way that that plays off each other is the worst of all worlds, especially for this type of story. Charlie sees the best in people, analyses Ellie's behaviour and reframes it in terms of acts of kindness, regardless of the inherent and underlying cruelty of the action, constantly willing to excuse and offer an alternate interpretation of her behaviour. He reads her petulant notes and realises that it's an accidental haiku, which he tries to internalise. He interprets her recording Thomas's confession and sending it to his church as helping him, based entirely on the consequences and not the initial act, given how they choose to forgive him. That ultimately she does care and has trouble properly expressing that. But if that's the case, then what does that mean for the Greasefire Facebook post? Or for him knocking him out with sleeping pills? Or for that matter, forcing him to stand up and walk over to her without the aid of an apparatus? Something he later does for himself at the end of the movie, an act which ultimately kills him. Within the context of Ellie, holding the view that people are incapable of not caring doesn't make Charlie seem like a deeply generous and empathetic soul of the world. He just looks like an idiot. Strictly speaking, that in itself doesn't need to be a problem, but his excuses and ignorance with regard to what she does to him becomes deeply suspect in the context of the movie's underlying message. His whole pursuit at the end of his life is to encourage Ellie to not take her hatred out on the world and to help embrace her supposed innate inner capacity to help and be giving. But what does that mean given his willingness to overlook the shit that she throws directly in his face? A lot of this rests on the grave assumption that people are actually trying to help when they behave cruelly to others. Which could only be true if we are also assuming that the victims of that cruelty don't know what's good for them. And gosh, isn't that the movie's attitude in a nutshell? Tough love. If you hurt someone's feelings the right way, they will make a change for the better. The reason for this is because the story needs Charlie's death at the end to be both inevitable and inspiring for both the characters and its intended audience, in no small part because Charlie, like all Aronofsky protagonists, is defined by his Christ-like capacity to suffer. A lot of the movie and stage play is about Charlie actively denying himself the help that he needs. He, like the movie presumes the audience does, knows what he is and has no inclination to help himself. Because much like Charlie, the whale is absolutely determined for Charlie to die and provide some kind of moral lesson about the weight of his own guilt. As per the story, there is no reason for Charlie to stay alive by the end of the movie. His life is too much of a burden for the other characters. We're told, in no uncertain terms, that Ellie is to receive $120,000 from him after he passes away, that Liz will be unburdened from his care and will be able to move on emotionally, that Thomas the missionary will be spiritually reaffirmed, and that his ex-wife Mary will be able to achieve closure from their relationship. And so Charlie's incentive to stay alive and pull himself from the wreckage before it's too late is... Let's talk about that money thing for a second, because this plot twist particularly annoys me. It's revealed toward the end that Charlie has $120,000 stashed away to give to Ellie after he passes, and he's been actively denying himself healthcare in order to do that. Earlier in the film, he lied to Liz about not having the money when she begs him to go to the hospital, and this revelation creates immense friction between the two. This frustrates me because doing it this way sidesteps the actual underlying reason why fat people avoid healthcare. Katie Rife, in her excellent review for Polygon, lays this issue bare, that fat people don't go to the hospital not out of self-penance, but for the far simpler reason of medical stigma. Doctors can behave remarkably cruelly and are disproportionately likely to dismiss, demean, and misdiagnose them. It is a very, very real problem that the story makes an excuse for itself to not have to deal with. This is actually a constant issue where the movie fails to properly engage with the real societal issues surrounding the subject on both the director end and screenwriter end. You've got Sam Hunter's writing, which has Charlie glibly dismissing Liz's concerns with funny sitcom one-liners, and you've got Darren Aronofsky, who can't imagine Charlie's life being much more than eating a bunch, being harassed in his unkempt house, and maybe the 2016 Republican presidential nominations going on in the background, because we're clearly trying to point the camera down the back of America's sofa. Between the two creatives, the movie very straightforwardly has a point of view that it's trying to launder, and is so single-mindedly headed in that direction in an Ahab way, see I Can Do Crap Moby Dick illusions too, that it has to avoid touching reality as much as it can, a reality where fat people are, for the most part, doing okay and trying to live their best lives as much as society lets them. You also got two tones that go in two different directions, neither of which want to treat the subject with any gravitas or respect. The whole thing has this dour, gothic, miserabilist quality to it on Aronofsky's end, which contrasts fairly sharply with Sam Hunter's kitsch, twee, new sincerity writing style, particularly present in that ending, which is exactly the sort of maudlin shit that would rightfully get you mocked on The Simpsons back in the 90s. And we end this way because Charlie's life is too much of a burden and they would rather Charlie die and his friends be in the right for all the things they threw at him rather than him pull his life together, because fatness is a fallen state of being that inevitably ends in oblivion, in the most toothless reaffirming of the status quo they could have possibly gone with. Earlier on, I asked the questions, honesty to what and truthfulness for whom? And I think we know our answer by now. Ultimately, the reason for the adulation and the reverent applauding and the public displays of flattery is because the whale is ultimately affirming, not of fat people, but of society's attitudes towards fat people, and making the average size feel good about what they already think. That fat people are gross and sad, and that they are the way they are because of trauma and refusal to exercise. That these people are broken and whose bodies are purely as a result of what they do to themselves, which reflects a spiritual sickness in society, and thus the thin and able-bodied can pat themselves on the back as they reassert themselves as society's benevolent superiors. As Lindy West so brilliantly put it, they hate us so much that this is what they make when they are trying to like us. The Whale wants to be a helpful, empathetic portrait of those it ultimately depicts dishonestly, and tells on itself when all it has to offer is veiled invective and spite, with all the depth and insight of a Ricky Gervais joke. I mean, going by the movie's own metric for honesty here, Gervais' stick is actually preferable, because at the very least his stuff is an actually honest expression of his own sincerely held opinions. The Whale very obviously thinks that Charlie is disgusting, to use its own phraseology there, and doesn't even have the stones to own it. It is an ugly, insincere, fundamentally mean-spirited and contemptuous film pretending to be an act of altruism, and the only thing that you can really say for it
is that Brendan Fraser is a gem of an actor. The milk of human decency flows through that man's veins, and it's obvious going by the sheer goodwill people have for him that he is not going to need to rely on this movie to go further. I'm as glad as anyone that he got to take his victory lap all the way to the Academy Awards, especially after all the shit that he's been through, but I honestly can't see the mainstream legacy of that performance doing anything for its subject, in much the same way that Precious didn't do anything for poverty, nor Silver Linings Playbook did anything for mental health, nor Green Book for racism.
This book made me think about my own life. And then it made me feel glad for mine.
Because ultimately, these kinds of projects exist as a kind of misery tourism, not speaking for their subject, but to their ghoulish onlookers, and how sad it felt when one of them got to be one of us for a bit. Hey everyone, so wow, this video took ages to produce, in no small part because thinking through everything and like gathering together my thoughts made me like profoundly sad, and also like life stuff happened, so like I don't think there's a better time for me to say, if you like what I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. The link is on the screen right now. I would also like to personally thank every single patron that is scrolling across the screen right now. You folks literally put food in my mouth. So thank you all so much for being patient with me and supporting me through this year, which has been terrible. Hope to see you for the next one. So thank you very much, and goodbye for now.